Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today we'll begin another topic on the lyrics of Chu, entitled Qu Yuan and the Lisao, the poem and its author as a composite text. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest host, Martin Kern, Professor of Chinese Literature at the Princeton University. Professor Kern will present his first episode entitled The Meaning of Qu Yuan in the Western Han. Let us warmly welcome Professor Kern.
Hello, everyone. In the following 3 episodes, I will offer my thoughts on the story and the poetry of Qu Yuan, who for 2 millennia has been celebrated as the greatest poet of ancient China. I will explore the critical dimensions of the Han Dynasty meaning of his story, the fusion of Qu Yuan's poetry and biography, and the nature and structure of the central text attributed to Qu Yuan, Encountering Sorrow, or in Chinese, Lisao. This poem has been interpreted in many different ways, but most scholars since antiquity have agreed on one point. The Lisao is the autobiographical composition of Qu Yuan, the aristocratic statesman of the ancient state of Chu. His traditional dates are 340 to 278 BCE, but these were speculatively reconstructed generations later. The Lisao, in the traditional view, is Qu Yuan's masterpiece and the fountainhead of the southern poetic tradition of the Chu Ci, the verses or lyrics of Chu. It is both the beginning and the climax of this tradition, both unprecedented and unsurpassed. Following directly on Professor Wu Fusheng's magisterial introduction to the Chu Ci and the Lisao, I won't repeat what is already known, established, and cherished. Instead, I will take the opportunity to advance a different reading of Qu Yuan. I will not talk about Qu Yuan as a historical person, let alone as the author of quote-unquote his texts. I will talk about Qu Yuan as a composite textual configuration into which are inscribed the principal ideals of Han Dynasty intellectuals. In their texts, from Jia Yi's Mourning Qu Yuan, Diao Qu Yuan, to Sima Qian's biography of Qu Yuan, and from Liu An to Liu Xiang, these intellectuals, over the course of 2 centuries of the Western Han, shaped themselves in the figure of Qu Yuan, and they shaped Qu Yuan in their own image. The Qu Yuan we know only developed within the matrix of Han imperial literature and politics. In this, I do not question the actual existence of the historical Qu Yuan. He most likely was more than a figment of Han imagination. But what exactly he was remains utterly elusive to critical historical inquiry. If by critical inquiry we mean more than just a simple belief in whatever Sima Qian tells us. Thus, instead of dwelling on Qu Yuan, the historical person, I shift the emphasis to what Qu Yuan meant to those writers who first mentioned him, cherished him, and imagined him in ways in which they could see themselves. The earliest of these writers lived a full 100 years after Qu Yuan, during the early decades of the Western Han dynasty. That is, shortly after the creation of the imperial state. The Qu Yuan these writers knew was the Qu Yuan they imagined from a distance of 3 generations, a distance that spanned the dramatic political and cultural transformation from pre-imperial to imperial China. No pre-imperial source known to us contains any mention of Qu Yuan, and no Han author speaking of Qu Yuan refers to any pre-imperial source beyond Qu Yuan's poetry itself. Whether or not we believe in Qu Yuan's historical existence, what truly matters is this. The Qu Yuan we know, the only Qu Yuan available to us, is the amalgamation of 2 distinct origins. First, a set of poems, starting with the Lisao, and second, the Western Han Qu Yuan biography, through which this poetry was interpreted. Today, I invite you to ask the following. Why is Qu Yuan important during the Western Han? What does his existence signify in the minds of Han writers? What does his poetry signify? Let me start out noting some, but by no means all, of the ways in which we can think about these questions. In Qu Yuan, Western Han intellectuals recollect the exemplar of the old true aristocracy. They tell themselves of the prophesied fall of Chu to Qin, together with the necessity of the subsequent collapse of Qin and the rise of Han. They remember the religious, historical, and mythological traditions of Chu. They reflect on the paradigm of the high-minded, aristocratic, and loyal political advisor who ends in exile and suicide, a fate never far away from Han Dynasty court scholars. They recall the literary heritage of Chu, the very region from which the Han imperial family had originated, and that was still eminently present in Western Han literary and philosophical culture. And finally, perhaps most consequentially of all, they develop a new ideal of literary authorship that these scholars and writers then assumed for themselves. In defining Qu Yuan, Han intellectuals defined themselves, and so have legions of Chinese intellectuals ever since. Toward this end, the idea of Qu Yuan the poet was of critical importance. Compare, for example, Qu Yuan with the famous figure of Wu Zixu from the early 5th century BCE, another solitary hero and one far more widely known in early China. Wu Zixu's multifaceted story, rich in historical detail and development, appears already extensively in pre-imperial texts. Qu Yuan's story appears in none. Yet in pre-Qin or Han times, Wu Zixu's heroism is never told in poetry, let alone in pseudo-autobiographical poetry attributed to himself. Wu Zixu merely survives in stories and anecdotes. Qu Yuan, by contrast, is unique. He is celebrated as China's first great poet and also attracts an entire anthology of poetry from others who took him as their model. Entirely unknown to the textual tradition before the Han, it was Qu Yuan alone who emerged as the exemplary figure of poet-hero and maligned royal advisor in whom Han intellectuals were to recognize themselves. His complete absence to date in the numerous manuscript finds from pre-imperial Chu, and even in Chu area manuscripts from the early Western Han, seems to confirm even further that this story was primarily of interest to certain Han intellectuals at the highest level of Han society and politics. That is, precisely people like Jia Yi, Liu An, Sima Qian, or Liu Xiang. Jia Yi was exiled to the south, Liu An driven into suicide, Sima Qian given the choice between suicide and castration, Liu Xiang repeatedly punished and then imprisoned. They all suffered in ways they could easily see prefigured in the very Qu Yuan persona they themselves helped to shape in their writings. There are further ways in which the Qu Yuan persona spoke to the Western Han imagination. In Han sources, the story of Qu Yuan is directly tied to the destruction of the old eastern state of Chu by Qin in 223 BCE, 2 years before Qin's creation of the unified empire in 221 BCE. When Chu fell, Qu Yuan had long been dead, but according to the Shiji, he had already warned King Huai of Chu that Qin was a state of tigers and wolves that cannot be trusted. Both in the Shiji and elsewhere, this phrase is attributed to various other pre-Qin historical figures, while in the Qu Yuan biography, it is only spoken by him, where he appears as the principal prophet of Chu's demise. And after Qu Yuan's death, Sima Qian tells us, quote, Chu was diminished by the day, until several dozen years later, it was finally extinguished by Qin. End of quote. And this is the end of the Qu Yuan biography. It was probably at Liu An's court of Huainan, located at Chu's former last capital Shouchun in modern Anhui, that the first Chu Ci anthology was compiled and the persona of Qu Yuan defined. But Qu Yuan was not only the prophet of the demise of Chu. His comment on Qin as being the land of tigers and wolves also presaged why Qin would ultimately fail, only to be replaced by a new dynasty, the Liu family's Han, that emerged from the former Chu territory. Thus, Qu Yuan's prophecy, recalled by Han authors, spoke directly to Han intellectual and political needs, which themselves emerged from the old Chu capital, now located in the Chu kingdom of Huainan, but within the imperial space. This leads directly to the second way in which Qu Yuan represents Han concerns. In the Western Han view from Shouchun, Qu Yuan, descendant of one of the 3 royal lineages of the old state of Chu, was an ancestor. The culture and history of Chu, now surviving at the old capital, was the culture and history of the Han imperial house. Qu Yuan and the poetry attributed to him offered a view of both the former aristocratic Chu culture, now surviving with Liu An and his court, and of Chu history, mythology, and religion, distributed across different parts of the Chu Ci anthology. Most importantly, the Lisao, the Jiu Ge, or 9 songs, the Tianwen, or questions on heaven, and the Jiuzhang, or 9 manifestations. The third way in which the Qu Yuan persona spoke to the intellectual and political needs of the early Han was that it exemplified and embodied the ruler-minister debate. The centrality of loyal and upright advisors for good rulership, which of course was a position of self-interest for Han intellectuals, but also the centrality of this position together with the outcry over unjust punishment. Jia Yi, just like Qu Yuan, ended exiled to the miasmic south. And when Sima Qian placed both together into the same biographical chapter of the Shiji, he mirrored and explained Qu Yuan and Jia Yi against each other. The fourth and final way in which the Qu Yuan persona responded to Han political and cultural imagination was his stature as the first heroic poet. Scholarship over the past 2 decades has firmly established that notions of individual authorship had little purchase before the empire, but arose forcefully with the historical imagination and self-imagination of Western Han writers. The urgency of this new idea is nowhere more clearly expressed than in Sima Qian's Shiji, where the historian presents himself as both the foremost reader and a new author in the image of those from the past whom he imagines as his intellectual and moral predecessors. First among them, Confucius and Qu Yuan. Only twice does Sima Qian claim to visualize the persona of an author just from reading his works. Quote, "When reading Lisao, Tianwen, Zhaohun, and Aiying, I grieve over his resolve. Ever since I traveled to Changsha and saw where Qu Yuan drowned himself in the abyss, I never can help shedding tears, and I see him before me as the person he was. 详见其为人." End quote. When reading the writings of Confucius, I see him before me as the person he was. 详见其为人. Thus, Qu Yuan is not merely the poetic hero. He also is the heroic poet. To Sima Qian, the supreme reader and biographer, it is the text that leads us to the true nature of the person, where the author is finally known and understood. In this, Qu Yuan the author becomes dependent on Jia Yi, Liu An, Sima Qian, and Liu Xiang as his readers. It is the latter who now imagine the former, who rescue the text and with it the person. As Han writers remembered Qu Yuan, they also created themselves as his followers, seeking the same future remembrance for themselves. Both Qu Yuan and his rememberers are noble men without power, high-minded individuals who insist on nothing but their moral excellence and who create a textual legacy for their own names to survive. To this end, the Han Dynasty Qu Yuan was inscribed with a set of concepts supremely important to the writers of the time, a set of concepts that in this constellation had not existed before. So much for today. In my next episode, I will be exploring how Qu Yuan's poetry and biography flow seamlessly into each other and constitute each other in the process.
Let us thank Professor Kern for such a stimulating talk. We look forward to his presentation of the next episode next Tuesday.